Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a really nice day. We were talking a little bit earlier when we were walking about Broderick Johnson said what he might have done in college on a nice day like today. And he said if he had a room like Ream, he might have been in here studying and at events. But in college on a day like today, he might be outside as well, too. My name's Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and I'm happy to welcome you all here to this talk. I'm particularly delighted to welcome a distinguished Holy Cross alumnus, Broderick Johnson of the class of 1978. Mr. Johnson serves in the White House as assistant to President Barack Obama, as cabinet secretary, and as chairman of the My Brother's Keeper task force, the subject of his talk today. Johnson is a native of Baltimore, Maryland. He earned a BA in philosophy right here from the College of the Holy Cross. You can tell your parents if you want to be a philosophy major, there's life afterwards, so there are possibilities there. He went on to a law degree. He said he wanted to be a philosophy professor, but he went on to a law degree ultimately at the University of Michigan. He joined the White House staff in 2014, though he's been an informal advisor and friend to President Obama since 2003. He worked in the 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. Before that, he was senior congressional affairs advisor to John Kerry's 2004 presidential campaign. Mr. Johnson began his career as an attorney in the House of Representatives, drafting landmark legislation, including the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993 and the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. During the Clinton administration, he served as deputy assistant to the president for legislative affairs. He's worked quite successfully in the private sector in various capacities as a vice president of AT&T and Bell South corporations, as a partner in Bryant Cave, an international law firm, and as co-founder of the Collins Johnson Group, specialists in providing strategic policy and communications advice to corporations and nonprofits. He served as a board director of philanthropic and academic groups, including Concerned Black Men, Project North Star, the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan. As if those accomplishments weren't enough, though, he managed to marry someone who I've long admired, the NPR journalist Michelle Norris. Together they have 3 children. I just want to say a bit about our format for today. Mr. Johnson's going to offer remarks on My Brother's Keeper, and then participate in a question and answer session with some student panelists. Our panelists who've been preparing on aspects of My Brother's Keeper, thinking about that today, are Greyson Ford, who's a senior with a classics and public policy major, policy studies major, Jewel Duberry-Douglas, a second-year student from Mattapan, Mass, who studies political science. Marcellis Perkins, at the end, is a first-year student and a Virginia native. Lance Madden is a second-year student from Dorchester, and he's a math major. And Isaish Baker is a senior economics major from Pennsylvania. And they were selected by a group of students who helped put things together, and I'd like to thank them, Ariel Baker, Nicholas Jones, Raham Malin, Marcellis Perkins, Cecilia Plain, Edgar Rodriguez, and Jolene Scott. After that conversation, Mr. Johnson and the panelists, with the panelists, will open the conversation to questions and answers from the larger audience as well. When we get to that point, we'd ask that those who'd like to ask questions go to the microphone there. We're recording today's event, and we'd like to make sure that everyone who hears that event online can also hear your questions. So please join me in welcoming Broderick Johnson for a talk titled My Brother's Keeper, Closing the Opportunity Gap for Young Men of Color. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that incredible introduction. And I have a lot to say because I have been back here in 28 years. And this panel here is a little bit imposing. They all look so ready to grill me, but it's okay. I can handle it. I'll look forward to engaging. I look forward to questions with all of you and a dialogue as well. As I just said, it's been 28 years, and I have to admit I'm a little bit nervous because for me this is where so much really started. This is where a lot of my opportunities really sprung from the time I spent at this campus, and yet I have not always been quite kind of compatible with my Holy Cross experience for reasons that I'm not sure I quite understand. And so when I came here today and I was driving on campus, I was pretty moved by it all. I'm still very moved by it all because I had some incredible times here, some wonderful times, some important growth times, and I feel like this is a renewing of a relationship with Holy Cross. So I'm profoundly grateful for that. I would have been outside on a day like today. I know the winters are pretty tough. I'm glad you all are here. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to ask you to go leave or we go outside or something. But I used to live in, Bevan used to be a dorm, and I lived on the second floor, and my roommate and I would put our speakers out in the window and entertain all the students who were sunbathing on days like today. So it's one of the many memories I remember. The last time I was here was my 10th reunion in 1988. Yesterday I had an interview with a writer for the Alumni magazine, and talk about a trip down memory lane. She knew things about me that I had forgotten or wanted to forget, for example. So I was a DJ at the radio station. Is there still a radio station, WCHC? Okay. So I was a DJ, and I had 2 shows, and I think the station, though, the range hit 3 of the dorms on campus. So there may be 20 people who were actually listening to my shows, but it was a combination of rock and progressive jazz. So I enjoyed it a lot, learned a lot about music. I was also a thespian. I was in the senior play, which got extended by an additional night because people were so amazed by, I think, by my routines, for example. I was also a gym rat. I don't know when Hart opened, except I think it opened in 77 or 78, and I spent a considerable amount of time studying in the Hart Center. But that conversation yesterday opened up just a trunk load of wonderful memories about my time here at Holy Cross in the mid to late 70s. Again, it was such a formative, remarkable period in my own early adulthood. So I am incredibly grateful to have been asked to come back here, and I'm humbled by it as well. It gives me a great pleasure to say that I am indeed a proud Crusader and a lifelong Crusader. And again, I'm grateful to be able to renew this relationship. There are a couple of things I want to say formally to start off with about kind of 3 intersecting themes. First is the improbable, because it relates. I would like to share with you all some things about my own life that have been quite improbable and that speak to some things that I think are important that I share with you. Second, also then, of course, want to talk about my role working for the president, a little bit about my role as cabinet secretary, and then finally I want to talk about my brother's keeper, about what led the president to start MBK, as we refer to it, what we have accomplished and what we hope to accomplish over the next 10 months and even beyond that. So let me start with the improbable. First of all, to the Holy Cross basketball team. And there are many wonderful things about being improbable. And I know that as I watched you all go through the second and third rounds in the championship of the Patriot League, I was so proud of you. And I heard the word improbable mentioned so many times by the announcers. But my hat's off to you, to the students, but also, of course, to the players and the coaches. I just want to congratulate you for helping to bring some real March Madness to me as well. So hats off. I just want to start by thanking you all for what you did. Now, to the improbable about my own life. So I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and if you know about anything about Baltimore, it still was and still is a very difficult place. I was raised by parents who, throughout their lives, strived to be in the middle class in a very segregated city, a city that's still too segregated. When I was in the second grade, my teacher summoned my mother to her classroom to warn my mom that I was already a bit of a knucklehead or hoodlum, that I was, in fact, on my way to reform school, what we now refer to as the school-to-prison pipeline, of course. So my parents were outraged, of course, by this, and so they didn't like the idea that their baby boy was on his way to reform school. So they promptly took me out of public school and put me in Catholic school. That's how I began my Catholic grade school education. When I got here to Holy Cross, I had a history advisor who said to me at the beginning of my second year, Broderick, your grades are awful. Maybe you don't belong in college. Maybe you should go join the Army. I won't name who that professor was. I don't know if he's still here. Probably not, but it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that I had not come here ready to excel as I should have. I came here, I thought that just arriving on campus, being the first in my family to go to college, was almost enough of an achievement in and of itself. So the first 3 semesters here were a challenge for me, quite frankly, and it was my own set of challenges I'd created because I did not come here ready to work as I should. So for those of you who may have had similar experiences, I'm not going to look to any of you in particular, but if when you got here you didn't do so well in the beginning, perhaps you would agree with me that sometimes when you get to a place like this, if you don't jump in right away and start working hard, you end up paying for it later. You end up making up for it. I was able to do that. But this history professor said, maybe you should go west, go to community college, join the Army, something other than being at Holy Cross. Now, I had to say that was bizarre advice. I'd come back ready to dig in a bit. So I decided that I would change majors. I had fallen in love with philosophy. Had a professor, dear man by the name of Professor George Hampsh, who became quite a scholar in studies of peace and equity. He became a very important mentor to me. I took every one of his classes that I could. And I have to tell you that my experience here as a philosophy major was very important to me excelling here and to doing what I've been able to do in life. It's not as though those kinds of questions about how I would do even when I went to law school went away. Honestly, throughout my career, especially early on, I still had to deal with questions about what was possible, whether I'd come to the right school, whether at Michigan I was in the right place, whether when I left Michigan, whether it was a good idea for me to go to Capitol Hill. Life lesson in all that for me was when someone said to me then, you should lower your expectations. What I always did, and I think it's because of what my parents, of course, taught me early on, was when someone does that, not only do you exceed those expectations, but you look for new ones to reach. And you don't let someone's own characterization of your life bring you down or make you settle for less. So I've had a whole set of improbable circumstances that I am incredibly grateful for. I'm also clear that it's been but for the grace of God that I've been able to do many of the things that I've been able to do, notwithstanding the fact that as a second grader I was on my way to reform school. The ultimate improbability, though, for me, in terms of my career, is watching Barack Obama become the first African-American president of the United States, and to have had any part in that whatsoever, quite improbable, but then also now to have risen to the point where I am a senior advisor to the president and meet with him on an almost weekly basis and sometimes several times during the course of a day, depending on what the issues are. So let me talk about what it's like briefly to serve the president, particularly this president. Of course, working in the White House is incredibly demanding, particularly as a senior advisor to the president. You're on edge almost all the time. I'm waiting for my BlackBerry to start ringing now to tell me that there's something I need to attend to, but this is more important. You all can vouch for me. There are incredibly smart people, starting with the president and first lady that you work with on a daily basis. Many very young people who just graduated from colleges like Holy Cross, who are working in the White House in pretty demanding positions already. That makes you, of course, that keeps you on your P's and Q's as someone more senior like me to make sure that I am learning from people who work incredibly hard all the time, even those who are several decades younger than I am. Unbelievable experiences, though. For example, when I traveled with the President and First Lady to Selma, Alabama in March of 2015, around the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, what an incredible day. It was a day very much like this in terms of the weather. Being with the president in the East Room of the White House a few months ago when he announced executive actions on guns, and watching the president get incredibly emotional, as emotional as I've ever seen him. Last fall when Pope Francis came to the White House, something that, again, you talk about improbable, particularly given some of the conflicts and clashes that some leaders in the Catholic Church have had with the president over some of his policies, to have this Pope visit the White House, and then, for me personally, as a lifelong Catholic, to have had the opportunity to have the president introduce me to the Pope and to discuss the work that I get to do, especially with young folks in this country who need better opportunities and a better chance. So let me talk a little bit, though, about my role as the Cabinet Secretary. I was asked in February of 2014 to join the White House staff, even though I've known the president since 2003 and been involved in several of his campaigns, and again, I've gotten to know him as a dear friend, but it would have been a professional mistake of my life if I had not put myself in a position to work for the president over these 8 years in an official capacity. Today's cabinet includes the heads of 15 departments, everyone from the Secretary of State to the Attorney General to the secretaries of relatively recently created departments like the Department of Homeland Security. The cabinet also includes the heads of agencies to which cabinet rank has been extended, like the Environmental Protection Agency, which of course is led by a great person from New England, Gina McCarthy. As cabinet secretary, here in a nutshell are the things that I do. First, I serve as a senior advisor to the president as part of a group of 20 people who meet with the president as sort of the board of directors of the White House. We get involved in all sorts of decisions, big and small, that are important for the president to have decided or to get our advice on. I am the president's lead liaison to all members of the cabinet. I coordinate among the various departments and help the agencies in policy development and in communicating the president's agenda. The president regularly engages with this cabinet, and I have a small team that helps me coordinate in that work. You all probably seen these formal cabinet sessions. The press will come in. The president will be sitting in the cabinet room with the cabinet secretaries around him. It happens on a quarterly basis. It's my job principally to organize those meetings and to determine the agenda and help prepare the president's remarks. The first cabinet meeting that I had in this role was probably 3 months after I started at the White House, and I'd asked my then deputy whether I should be prepared for the president to ask me a question in front of all of these cabinet secretaries. And he assured me it's never happened with this president. Don't worry about it, Broderick. It's fine. Well, anyway, the president said, Broderick, would you say something to the cabinet about such and such? And I still don't remember what it was that I said that day, but it was really quite a moment. And always be prepared, I guess, right? This president's been very clear in his guidance to his cabinet through me to anticipate problems. Look, it is not a good day if there is something in the press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, or otherwise, that is a surprise coming out of one of the agencies that we didn't know in the White House. Whenever that happens, I feel like I'm going to lose my job. So I work really hard to make sure it doesn't happen, but it does happen still sometimes, but we work very hard to try to make sure that those things don't happen. We take a very holistic interagency approach in the White House. For example, with Detroit, you all know the city of Detroit, of course, was on the brink of collapse. The city went into bankruptcy. The auto industry was dying. The president took a very aggressive approach about Detroit, and the city is coming back slowly but surely. There are still problems in the Department of Education for the city of Detroit. There were some indictments mentioned yesterday, for example, having to do with some principals. But otherwise, the city of Detroit, and it's important to fix the schools in Detroit, don't get me wrong, but the city of Detroit is coming back in many, many ways. And it's been through the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, and many other departments that we have been able to focus the attention of this administration on helping bring the city of Detroit back to where it needs to be. On climate change, the end of 2015 saw one of the most consequential moments of this president's legacy. That was the historic agreement that came out of Paris on the COP21 negotiations. Again, the president directed his entire staff and his cabinet through me to take a tightly coordinated approach, and we did that. On criminal justice and reentry, by the way, It's now in the press, but today the President of the United States had an informal lunch meeting with a group of 12 people whose sentences have been commuted by this president, by President Bush, and by President Clinton. Now just think about that the President of the United States would use some of his time today to just have an informal lunch discussion with people who have served their time and have struggled, though, in some cases, to rebuild their lives. It's a remarkable thing, similar to when the President visited federal prison in Oklahoma. It really goes to, for me, Matthew 25 and what is said there about what it means to visit people in prison and what it says about serving the Lord in that capacity. So if I'd been there today, it would have been a remarkable event for me to have been part of. But criminal justice reform is a major, major effort for the President. Not only is the Attorney General working on these issues, but also Departments of Labor, HHS, the Education Department, Housing and Urban Development, and the Small Business Administration are all working on those things. The Cabinet then is also very much a part of my brother's keeper, which brings me to MBK. It was about 2.5 years ago that the President spoke to the entire nation in response to the verdict in the Trayvon Martin case. The President spoke very poignantly about the angst and the anger that parents and families were feeling, and about the challenges facing too many young people, especially boys and young men of color. In those remarks, the President said, quote, you all remember this, quote, Trayvon Martin could have been my son. The President went on to say that 35 years ago, he could have been Trayvon Martin. And he went on to say that there are a lot of kids out there who need help but are getting a lot of negative reinforcement. There has to be more we can do to give them a sense that their country cares about them and values them and is willing to invest in them, close quote. So 6 months after that speech on Trayvon Martin, on February 18, 2014, the President launched My Brother's Keeper in a ceremony in the East Room of the White House with all the pomp and circumstance that is fitting for a White House event on any subject. That's how important this issue is to the President. During his remarks, the President reflected on how personal these issues are to him by reflecting on his own personal experiences. He said he could see himself in these young men, and the only difference is that he grew up in an environment that was a little bit more forgiving. So when he made a mistake, the consequences were not as severe. And finally, the President said this: the plain fact is that there are some Americans who, in the aggregate, are consistently doing worse in our society, groups that have had the odds stacked against them in unique ways that require unique solutions, groups who've seen fewer opportunities that have spanned generations. By almost every measure, the group that is facing some of the most severe challenges in the 21st century in this country are boys and young men of color. There are lots of disparities. I could just name a few. Boys and young men of color are more likely than their peers to be born into low-income families and to live in concentrated poverty. They are more likely to live in one or no parent households, and they are more likely to attend high-poverty, poor-performing schools. In schools and in courts, these boys and young men of color too often receive harsher penalties for the same infractions as similarly charged white males, and are least likely to be given a second chance. They are more likely to live in communities with higher rates of crime, increasing the likelihood of negative encounters with police and victimization by violent crime. Black boys, for instance, are 6% of the nation's population, but more than half of the nation's homicide victims. It's the President's very clear conviction to change these factors, to affect these disparities, and so that's what MBK is all about. Give people second chances, but also to make sure that they don't end up in that pipeline in the first place. So we are taking an approach that involves from cradle through college and career readiness to reentry. And so it spans from 0 basically to 25 in terms of the real focus of MBK, again, as we refer to it. We got to make sure that this country is a place in which anyone who wants to succeed can succeed. But they need the tools and the opportunities. And then when those are available, folks have to be willing to work hard, and we have to make sure people understand that boys and young men of color understand that when the opportunities are there, they take them and they excel as much as they possibly can. This is not just a moral issue, though. As important as it is as a moral issue, it's also an economic issue. We continue to have millions of young men of color, especially, who are not participating in our economic system, who are disconnected, so to speak. And in terms of our competitiveness around the world, we cannot continue to suffer this way as a nation. We're taking a three-pronged approach out of the White House on this work. As chair of the task force on behalf of the president, there are three principal things that I work on. First, federal policy. So there are a gazillion programs across the agencies that focus on children and that are designed to try to bridge the gaps. But a lot of them have not worked as effectively as they should. It's not always about more resources. It's about the more effective use of resources. So we have looked at ways to make federal programs more effective to bridge the disparities that I mentioned. Second, a community-based approach. So people ask all the time, what's going to happen when President Obama leaves the White House to my brother's keeper? Well, the work has to be done at a community level. So there are more than 200 cities and tribal nations and counties across the country that have adopted what's called the My Brother's Keeper Challenge. That means that they go about this work as the president envisioned it in a certain way that is evidence and data-driven. There are a lot of wonderful anecdotes about mentoring programs. There are a lot of wonderful anecdotes about people who've changed folks' lives. But there aren't enough stories and there aren't enough examples that are scaled and that are financed about programs that actually work and make a difference. So that is a big part of the approach as well. And then finally, the private sector. More than $500 million has been contributed to programs by nonprofits and businesses and foundations across the country to do this work to support the efforts out of the White House and communities across the country. And one of the biggest things that has emerged is the National Basketball Association has committed across all the franchises, all the franchise cities, to help us recruit tens of thousands of people to be mentors. Kendrick Lamar recently released a video actually about this, about people becoming my brother's keeper and becoming mentors, focusing on his life as a mentor, but also as a mentee. Let me just stop there, have this panel grill me here for a while. I look forward to that opportunity. But let me just say, for me, when this is all over in 297 days, I know that I will continue to look for opportunities to work with then post-President Obama on these sets of issues, because he's committed to this work for the rest of his life, and I am as well. And honestly, it's clear to me it all started for me here at Holy Cross in terms of my education here, in terms of the values here, that quite frankly, I wasn't clear when I was a student here what I was necessarily getting until I left, until I realized that, well, you know what? A lot got founded here for me emotionally and in terms of values at this great college. It's so wonderful to be back here. God bless all of you. God bless Holy Cross. And God bless our great, great nation, because it is a great, great nation. So, you all ready? Do you all want to go down the row, or do you want me to call on you?
I can start.
Okay. Are you going to ask me a bunch of tough policy questions?
No, of course not. I wouldn't do that.
No, I can handle it.
Actually, my question's education-oriented. It seems that in the milestones that you've outlined in MBK, there's a heavy emphasis on education and the environment of the child. So I was interested in what influence did the MBK task force have in crafting the most recent landmark education bill, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and what's the plan going forward to make MBK work for education in addressing these inequalities we noticed as pretty pervasive?
Sure. So as the presidential memorandum that established My Brother's Keeper stipulates, the Department of Education, of the 10 or so agencies that are part of it, is a principal agency around My Brother's Keeper, right, to drive the resources from the federal government, but also policy. So the Department of Education then, of course, is very involved in the rewrite of the education law. And in that sense, therefore, MBK had, the MBK task force had input into that law. But at the same time, right, we look at federal policy out of the MBK task force. We don't necessarily prescribe changes in federal law based on that, beyond what the Department of Education works on or other departments work on in the course of their, say, their reauthorization of a particular law like the education law. There's no question, though, that when you look at the recommendations that we are meeting in the MBK-related work across all those milestones, that, as you noted, a lot of it really is about education from K through 12 all the way through college and career preparation, things around even being prepared for, what are they called, AP classes, for example. A lot of young men and young women of color would do well in AP classes, but there aren't incentives or there are disincentives for them to take those classes, so that's a big part of what is in our recommendations as well and that people are responding to. Okay.
Great.
Joel? Where are you from?
Mattapan, Massachusetts. So what are 3 steps you will take or that you hope to take in order to enhance My Brother's Keeper's federal presence after the Obama administration leaves?
Great question. There are a couple of things we're doing. First is trying to make sure that we are able to, this is a typical Washington term, embed changes in federal policy in ways that can be sustained for at least the next several years, if not beyond. So changing, say, a guidance in what the Department of Justice does in making grants related to reentry, right, in a way that's better focused, making sure that's not just through 2017, but goes through grants that are multi-year grants, and that, again, are very targeted at MBK-related disparity concerns. So that's one thing, and doing that across all the agencies that are part of MBK. Making sure, there are political appointees and career appointees, and of course, in the federal agencies. The political appointees will all go, right, or most of us will go, depending on who the next president is. But the career people, of course, many of them will still be there, trying to make sure then that career people who are committed to this work because it's so important to the nation will continue this work. And then we're looking at some broader things, quite frankly, in terms of what the next White House will do around My Brother's Keeper. And I can't get into the specific, except to say that we're looking at those things as well, so that we leave lasting change. But I will say that finally, we, though, are committed to this work post-presidency, that we will continue to work on in some dimension through nonprofit-related work, but also that will go on in these communities across the country. Okay. Lance?
All right. My question is, will My Brother's Keeper work with young men of color to push them towards STEM fields?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess you want an example. No, I'm kidding. I'll give you, no, this is timely. I'll give you a great example. First, I'll start with this. So the Department of Energy was not one of the original agencies that was part of the My Brother's Keeper task force.
Yes.
I'm not going to justify it. It just didn't happen. But now it is. Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, who's from this area, yes, right? This area is in Massachusetts. Was an incredible negotiator in the Iran negotiations, right? But also is very concerned about STEM education and making opportunities available to students of color and to women and girls as well. But with regard to MBK, then, he asked if his agency could become part of the MBK task force. So, of course, we said yes. One of the results of that is that about 3 weeks ago, Department of Energy sponsored a national day at the labs, 17 different national labs across the country. I went to one in Long Island, and there were thousands of young people of color who attended these Day in the Lab programs and learned about STEM education from practitioners, but also from students, say, from schools like Holy Cross, who are students of color who are now in, say, biochem majors or whatever else. So, and they also learned about, like, the economic possibilities for them, $80,000 jobs when they graduate from college, for example, in the STEM field. So it's not just about the education, but it's also about the job opportunities that are there. Is that a good answer?
Yes, I just have one follow-up question.
Of course.
What will My Brother's Keeper be doing to improve math and science scores in the young men in underfunded public schools?
So there are a number of STEM-related federal programs that provide resources through grant applications, through formula programs as well, to public school systems across the country. Again, trying to make sure those are better targeted and those funds are better used. And there are better plans for using those funds. So we're actually working with the Council of Great City Schools, which represents the 70 largest school districts or so around the country, to make sure that they are better positioned to provide more effective STEM education possibilities as well. But the private sector has a big role to play here, and we've been able to get a lot of private sector help on STEM-related education. I think we've got to demystify STEM education considerably as well. Okay. Because what's your major?
I'm a math major.
There you go. Okay. Isaiah, right?
Yes. In many ways, like My Brother's Keeper was born out of the continual discussion or the national discussion we're having on race. And, you know, in recent years, many have seen that as becoming more an antagonistic and divided topic amongst Americans. I was just wondering, how do you see a program like My Brother's Keeper interacting with, you know, with the dynamics of a national discussion on race?
So, great question. One of the things that we have, and this is again where, because it's the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, the leader of the free world who is driving this work, we get a great voice out there on these issues. Not that race then goes away, because it doesn't, of course. But we have felt all along, and this is where I mentioned the economic considerations too. Like, so for American business, My Brother's Keeper has to be important and successful as a way to make sure that workforces, right, are available. And in many communities, of course, that means that people of color need to be in a position to assume those jobs and to be prepared for tech-related jobs. For example, there's 500,000 jobs in the tech industry that are not being filled. But look, the general point is this, that My Brother's Keeper and the success of it has to be seen as important to the success of this country without regard to our racial differences. And I don't mean racial differences as in racial strife, but the fact that we are different, right, in terms of race. We have to get people to understand that it doesn't matter whether it's a young person of color. Everybody in this country has to have the opportunity to succeed, and we have to see all these children in this country as the responsibility of this society and the communities in which they live, and they are not the other. And a lot of times when you look at, say, what's happened in police-related shootings or what happens with regard to employment discrimination or other more subtle forms of discrimination, there's a sense, right, that somebody is just the other, is not connected to who you are. They're so different from you, you should fear them. You don't care how they do. Well, fundamentally, we have to change that, and that's why the president's been willing to use his voice so much in talking about MBK to the entire country.
In efforts to break down the school-to-prison pipeline and promote a cradle-to-college or career track, things such as the prison industrial complex and the war on drugs slow down this movement. What specifically does MBK work to, how do they work to undo these type of policies to bring a long-term solution to the type of problems that young men of color face?
So on the, state your question again, because it's really kind of complicated.
Okay. In efforts to break down the school-to-prison pipeline and promote a cradle-to-college or career track, things such as the prison industrial complex and the war on drugs kind of slow down this movement. What specifically does MBK do to undo these type of policies that will bring a long-term solution to the problem that young men of color face?
So on the first part about the school-to-prison pipeline, that's really kind of the fundamental approach to MBK across the early milestones especially. We know that, for example, if there were 4,000 suspensions of preschoolers in the United States in 2011, 2012, right? 4,000, right? These are like, I don't know, little fellas like this, most of them young boys of color, let out of preschool in some cases by law enforcement officials. We know that that has to stop, so one of the recommendations, strong recommendations in the MBK Task Force report is to end suspension and expulsions of preschoolers, not just brown and black, but any preschooler, right, in this country shouldn't be suspended or expelled. And so we have incentive programs to help schools deal with that, and daycare centers deal with those sorts of things as well. And some of that is on the trauma-related side of things. When a 4-year-old comes to preschool and has seen some things that would scare all of us, that kid has a reaction that the teacher needs to be aware of, is not indicative of this child being dangerous, right? That's one thing. But then all the way through, for example, on the issue of truancy, right? We know that a kid who misses a certain number of days in school over the course of a year is more likely to be on the path to dropping out of school than for a kid who is in school every day or just about every day. So we have a major effort that is focused through MBK on ending truancy by having what's called success mentors, working with kids in the 6th and 9th grades where truancy is especially a concern. And so across the different milestones, especially the first 4 in MBK, we're focused on trying to break that pipeline because, again, we know when it starts really early, and we know there are points along the way where it can get, of course, even more profound. With regard to prison-related issues, we have some work, of course, around MBK in the reentry space, so to speak. But a lot of that is being driven more actually out of efforts through the White House Counsel's Office and through the Department of Justice around reentry programs. And there's a major effort that's going on there through resources made available around reentry, because so much, of course, is about when people get out of prison, that they get a second chance, they get a second opportunity, or while they're in prison, that they have an opportunity to get a college degree. So we've done some work around Pell Grants related to that as well. But a lot of that focus is in the Department of Justice around reentry related programs. I don't know if folks here heard what the president did. I mentioned it, what he did today. Yes, I did start off with that. I wasn't just telling you that. Right? So that speaks a lot about his personal interest in these issues. So, do we go back through here and then Q&A?
Obviously, we've talked about a lot of great ways that MBK is working to fix a lot of inequalities, and the work's been recognized by not just Democrats, but Republicans too, and it has a lot of bipartisan support. I know you've referred to it as one of the least partisan issues for initiatives of this administration, but still not every state has adopted it. Just one hasn't.
No, it did.
Oh, it did? Oh,
yes.
Really? Oh, that's great.
Yes, all 50 states, although we haven't publicly announced it, now have an MBK, at least one MBK community.
So what was the strife there, getting that last state on board, and as more communities take hold, what's that hurdle to get more communities, because it seems that there's a lot of support around it?
So I don't know what was going on with that one state, which I won't mention. But
They just had a caucus, did they not? I'm pretty sure.
Anyway, I think what was going on in that state is that they had some, because MBK is not, MBK communities are cities for the most part and not states, although there are some like county-based MBK communities that have come on board. But I think that because of changes in the mayor in 2 of the largest cities in that state, that particular state, there was an absence of leadership. Somebody's got to step up and take that on. So that's been settled, and that one city in that state is now an MBK community. I think related to that, though, is this, and that is, for example, in the city of Philadelphia, which, is anybody here from Philly? Got to be somebody here from Philly, right? Almost. Yeah, almost. So MBK Philadelphia, as started by Mayor Nutter, has been one of the best examples of an MBK community from the beginning, and continues to be, even though Mayor Nutter, of course, has now left office, because Mayor Nutter made sure that not just the community and the police department, but also that his successor bought into MBK in a major way, and he made sure that was quite publicly developed. And so Philadelphia, but we have to be concerned that other cities, because of changes in leadership, changes brought on by elections and whatever else, will still be sustained. It's great to add on new MBK cities, and when we hear about another community that wants to be one, we're excited about that, but we're not so focused, of course, on the quantity of communities that are MBK communities, but the quality of those efforts. There are some communities that raised their hand and said they would do the work the way it has to be done, and then they haven't stepped forward and done that. So we're not in the position of trying to make everybody a great MBK community. It has to come from the ground up. But where there are communities like Philadelphia and Boston, Mayor Walsh has done a fabulous job in the city of Boston with MBK Boston, and it's given him license to talk about these issues in ways that he may not have been so comfortable talking about these issues before. But where we have examples like Philly and like Boston, like Detroit and some other cities, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that they become examples of how to build lasting, sustainable infrastructure and change so that other communities can figure out what to do to make themselves better and sustaining around this work. Build on the success, not spin our wheels trying to make everybody successful and using a lot of resources and wasting a lot of time.
Great. Well, I guess doing research, I was kind of curious in what incentives you have for communities and corporations to participate in this initiative aside from moral obligation.
So around what I mentioned with regard to truancy, so we have developed something called Success Mentors, working with the Department of Education, or driven through the Department of Education, though, and also with a group called Mentor Inc., right? And the idea here, again, is that we match mentors with 6th and 9th graders who are more prone to end up truant if they don't get attention, especially from a mentor on a regular basis. When we launched this about a month ago, there were 10 communities that were named because of their readiness to take on these types of mentoring programs. And there are 20 more communities that will be added to that in the next month or so. So where there are communities that are ready because of the work they've done to accept something that we can do out of the federal government around MBK, that has been the case over and over again. Again, building on successes in small ways, using incentives based on federal resources, and also through our connections in the private sector as well. So, thanks.
So my next question is, how will MBK support already existing initiatives like the that focus on like educating young men and young women of color, like the Crystal Ray Network or the KIP Network, the KIP program, sorry, and kind of how will they help those students and with them developing their professionalism?
Well, I think a lot of that is going to be then based on these plans that these local communities are coming up with. So the communities get together, and this has been the collaboration that's being built, and they decide within the community which programs kind of will fit under the umbrella within their MBK-related community. And it's different in many different places. In some places, for example, Boys and Girls Clubs, local chapters are part of it, or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. Because I should say this about MBK, while of course the work is especially focused on boys and young men of color, with regard to federal resources especially, we cannot have programs that are either gender or race exclusive. So everything that is a federal resource out of the federal government related to MBK has to be available to all kids. And so that's why I'd mentioned Boys and Girls Clubs as well, to the extent they're involved in our efforts around MBK in their communities. So it's more of a community-driven approach in terms of who's part of their collaborations. What we do try to, though, make sure is that people understand that MBK should be the umbrella under which other things, get associated, rather than MBK being part, say, of 20 different programs in a community that are all working and therefore would be probably vying against each other, competing against each other for resources.
In your time on Washington, have you witnessed an evolution in your own views about how the needs of the black community should be met and tackled in light of policy changes over the years?
Yeah, and even more recently, I have, I'm a lot more hopeful than I probably was a couple of years ago. And that's because, and more hopeful because of like what I see when I go across the country and the groups of young folks that I meet with, like guys who many people would say, you know, and even really young 8 and 9 year olds who folks would say, you know, because of where they're growing up, because of the income and the poverty levels in their communities, that there's no way they'll make it, and we just have to triage. There are people who kind of think that way, right? But I have met some unbelievable young people across the country who, despite all of these odds, and I think a lot of it is based on the sense that this president cares deeply about them. I mean, people feel it, and maybe it's because I'm out there as an emissary and they sense that, but I just see it and hear it all the time in ways that are profound. I also know that there are a lot of young folks out there who, like, if given a chance, they just want the opportunity to work real hard. And this whole notion that somehow people want to be sort of sitting around waiting to get government help and they're not willing to help themselves is just false. There are people who will just say, look, I just want the chance to work hard at meeting my dreams, but don't tell me I can't succeed or I got to wait for somebody else to come and help me. I met a young man, he's a young boy in Miami a couple weeks ago who is part of a program in Liberty City, and I think Liberty City is like one of the lowest incomes and highest poverty rates in the country. And this young man, he's 8 again, and he had one of those T-shirts on. It's an in memoriam T-shirt with like a picture of 2 young guys on his shirt, it's like, and then the dates on which they died. And these are 2 friends of, one was a cousin, one was a friend, both younger than 12 who'd been killed. I asked him about it, and he said that. But then, you know, a lot of times people will expect a young person like that to just say, I just want to, you ask him his career or life expectations, and people oftentimes would say a young person like that is just going to tell you they want to live to be 16, right? And that's kind of like all they hope for. I've heard that so many times. This young man was in all the other young men with him, young boys and men with him that day, talked about what college they were going to go to. And so, you know, that's not Pollyannish. There's no reason that given opportunities, that young boy can't end up at Florida State one day or at Holy Cross one day, right? And we just have to love them and give them the opportunities and not let them get away. So that's how I've changed. I'm more optimistic now. And I don't expect a lot from politics, though.
What steps is MBK taking in order to bridge a healthy relationship between men of color and the police?
So big focus has been, of course, on police, on community trust between especially young men of color and police, and that is, of course, one of the most daunting subjects and one of the hardest things and full of a lot of tragedy. But I'm always heartened when we see an MBK community where police are involved in the MBK plans in that community and are reaching out and working with young people. And there are a lot of places where that's happening. It's happening, I know, in Philadelphia, for example. And there are 2 things that emerge from that. One is, of course, trust, because we got to get to trust between police and the communities. We cannot have the kind of strife and the kind of division that we've continued to see lead to tragedy. So that's one thing. Second, of course, is even career opportunities, right? So for young men of color to understand, young women of color to understand that becoming a law enforcement person or leader in their community is a good path, a good career path. They need to get to know people who do those jobs and to understand what it takes to get there. We met a young man in New Orleans with the president who said he wants to be a Secret Service officer one day, for example. And we're helping him figure out how he can do that.
Well, to touch on Lance's question, you brought up how these policies have to be gender and race neutral. Obviously, there's examples like affirmative action that was a federal policy that was aimed to help young people of color, but it ended up just helping mostly young white women. advance in their education. So how are these new initiatives more focused on addressing the inequality opportunities that have more pervasive in people of color?
So affirmative action isn't dead, right? It's quite different, but it's not dead. In some states, it's dead, so to speak. In the state of Michigan, right, where I went to law school, and I got into Michigan Law School, I got into Holy Cross, I'm sure affirmative action had a significant role to play in me getting into both institutions, and I'm very proud of that, and I think I made a lot out of those opportunities. But given the opportunities that were denied my parents, it's like it was, more than this country could do. Nevertheless, I had to take advantage of those opportunities, and again, I talked about that a little bit here. But in Michigan, right, so the U.S. Supreme Court upheld affirmative action in 2004 in a case involving Michigan Law School. But the voters of Michigan then 2 years later in a referendum, right, voted to end affirmative action in the state of Michigan. So the impact of that at Michigan Law School, for example, is out of a class of 320 law students 2 years ago, there were 3 African-American males. When I was there were like 18 of us, and we were still fighting for larger percentages, right? But that's the impact, because Michigan cannot take race into consideration, not just in admissions, but also in scholarships and grants. So it's had a devastating effect in Michigan and has had a devastating effect in Texas. That's sort of based more on what's happening in the states. Affirmative action is still very much constrained, but alive in many other places as well. For MBK, we don't take on issues around affirmative action policy, right? Our approach is just to do everything we can to make sure that we help prepare these groups of boys and young men of color especially to be able to excel in whatever environment they are in, so that really at the end of the day affirmative action perhaps is less of a consideration or less of a barrier where it doesn't exist for them.
Yeah, my question was more towards the unintended benefits given to groups that are outside of the target range.
Well, so affirmative action certainly is intended to also make sure that women have opportunities they have not had before. The unintended consequence issue or question I think you're raising, I don't really, I have a different perspective on that. That doesn't concern me as much, perhaps, as your question would suggest. Of course.
Any questions from the audience?
Oh, great questions, you all, by the way. Thank you for those questions. I have a question. Can I ask a question? Sure. So is anybody in here a philosophy major? Anybody? Oh. Okay. All right. Too bad.
So part of the mission of the college is around social justice, and could you talk a little bit around, given the political climate right now, it's a little disheartening, what advice would you have for our folks who are particularly going to graduate soon around doing social justice work through the lens of government? So advice for graduates on doing social justice work in government.
So, look, I made kind of a flip comment about politics. Politics still deeply matters. It matters incredibly who's in charge of government and the impact that has on policies that affect social justice. So it is just really important for you all to engage in the voting process, to be involved in politics, to run for office, to make sure that this country, for both moral and economic reasons, is more fair and more just. Don't give up on it, even when you see a political environment like the one we're seeing now, where pretty negative, divisive stuff is being used that is, I think, a real threat to the fabric of this country. So I would say that. And then there's the individual stuff, though. I mean, mentoring, right? I'm sure there are many students here who mentor either when they're back home during the summers or perhaps even here in the Worcester area. It's really important to just, do your part. It's a social justice issue too, to reach back and help someone else. So both individually, but then also in terms of your career work, whether it's in politics or government or even in the private sector, don't give up on social justice issues. It's worth fighting for those positions that have resources.
First of all, thank you very much for coming. It sounds like my brother's keeper is doing some amazing work. And you forgive me if I don't know enough about it for my question to be answered. But as I listen to you speak, I can't help, as a Latino son of Latino immigrants, consider the sort of potential blind spot of not only this administration, but previous administrations, and the ugly history of mass deportation, and how many undocumented migrant workers have had opportunities taken from them simply by being forcibly removed from the country. Not to say there haven't been attempts to redress that, the Dreamer Act, for example. I'm wondering if My Brother's Keeper does anything specifically to reach out to the American-born children who've had parents forcibly removed and their specific challenges in the context of this conversation.
Honestly, from a federal level, we have not. Very specific to the children that you're talking about.
Dreamers, I think, is what they're referred to.
Yeah, right. Certainly, again, in communities in places like Texas, where there are lots of MBK communities, of course, in California, but not to stereotype what regions of the country we're talking about, right? Really depends on the makeup of communities. I'm sure there are a lot of the local action-related plans that are focused on the children, the U.S. citizen children that you're talking about. They have to be, particularly around education and mentorship and the like.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Thank you for coming, first of all.
Of course.
And my question is, how does MBK coexist in public school systems that have been recently facing budget cuts and that are already underfunded?
How do we coexist with them? So I think that, to the extent that we can't provide additional resources, because particularly in education, a lot of those resources that go from the federal government are formula-based, for example. There's just a limited impact that we can have on being able to provide more funding in federal programs beyond what we otherwise have available. We don't have, Congress hasn't given us new money to be able to help school systems. I think that what is very important to our work, though, is to make sure that, because there are a lot of foundations and businesses that partner with schools and school districts across the country to offer after-school programs or mentoring programs or apprenticeship programs. So I think more of our approach there is to make sure that we can pair up those kinds of businesses, or again, the National Basketball Association's work, which is really deep into the franchise cities, to help make up for what is lost. But otherwise, we don't have a pool of federal money that is new that we make available to school districts beyond what we would otherwise be able to make available. Okay, it's a good question. It's a tough, honestly, it's a really tough issue. We can't make something out of nothing in cases where school districts really don't have resources to do very basic things.
Thank you. I saw a video this morning in my Facebook feed of President Obama greeting the people at the White House this morning whose sentences had been commuted and inviting them to lunch. And it warmed my heart, and I thought it was just lovely. So I was so pleased to hear you mention it in your remarks.
Yeah.
And what it led me to think were a couple of things. What needs to be done in this country to restore the voting rights of people who have been incarcerated for felonies? And I'm so pleased that this president and some of the former presidents, commute sentences of people, and I think that Obama has really brought appropriate attention to the fact that we have these small, little drug offenses where people are being sent to jail for way too long, and that needs to be addressed. But what more can be done? I mean, I thought, great, he commuted the sentences of 60 people or whatever the number was, but there are thousands of people sitting in jail. So what can be done to really reform the situation? Like, what are the next steps?
Yeah, so the president really would, before he leaves office, is trying very hard to commute as many sentences as possible. But it is a long process to get a person's application ready and reviewed in order for a decision to come to the president about whether or not to commute someone's federal sentence. Now, a lot of people who are in prison, unfortunately, of course, are in for state-related offenses. So the first thing is the president will continue to do as much as he can, but there's just a limit because of the process to how many of these we can get done. He's done more collectively than any other president has been able to do. But still, he'd like to continue to do more, and he will do as many as he possibly can. The 61 today was a great step. 21 of those folks, by the way, would have died in prison because they had life sentences. So I met a man in Michigan whose sentence was commuted back in November, who had spent 18 years in prison for a nonviolent drug offense. He thought he would spend the rest of his life in prison, too. He wouldn't allow his family to come visit him because he just didn't kind of want to hear from them about what life was like on the outside. Now he's free at, I think, 63, 64 years old. The larger way to address this, of course, is through criminal justice reform, and that's where if Congress will just do it, and there's a lot of bipartisan support to get it done, we certainly can address both sides of it in terms of making sure that fewer people are going to prison in the first place, federal prisons especially, and then making sure that on the other side, in terms of recidivism, having more things in place to keep people from re-entering prison because there's such great recidivism that happens. So if Congress would just do one more big thing, there are a couple other things they could do, but this would be a crowning achievement, really, in terms of our work with them. And even conservatives, of course, get this in terms of the mass incarceration of people as not being smart or good for the country, either morally or economically. So, yes?
Thank you for being here, and thank you for the very important work that you're doing here with My Brother's Keeper. A question I had related to mass incarceration as well. I have been very intrigued, by the way, in this state of Massachusetts as the opioid crisis has spread. Charlie Baker, our governor, has framed it very much as a public health issue. And of course, that's in great contrast to what we've seen, when as the war on drugs, and Michelle Alexander talks about in her book, the new Jim Crow, how it was a criminal issue for so long in this country that led to mass incarceration. But I'm just wondering if what we're seeing in this state as this issue has spread more to white middle-class families and has then been framed as a public health issue instead of a criminal issue. Is that happening nationwide more, and do you see that as an avenue through which we might be able to address the mass incarceration issue?
Yeah, it's absolutely happening. The president was in Atlanta yesterday speaking about this issue, a big conference on opiate and heroin abuse, and he spoke about this, and he's made this a really important issue for him. And we're working through the agencies like HHS to try to help provide more and more funding through programs that they have, but also to bring a greater spotlight to these issues. And it's many states, led by Republicans and conservative legislatures, are now trying to tackle this issue of opiate and heroin abuse as a health issue rather than a criminal issue. So there's a movement that's building, and there's even more money that Congress is prepared to put into this. As it's become more of an issue for their states and their districts, it certainly has gotten more attention across the country. I would say this too, as particularly as someone who grew up in Baltimore, where heroin abuse has existed for decades. When I was a teenager, I remember meeting so many people who were heroin addicts at the time, and so I've wondered about this issue in terms of what's happened for generations in minority communities especially. And I guess I would just say this, because there's some people who I think, would view this all cynically and say, well, it wasn't until it got into white communities and states with large white populations that we've seen this attention. My view is, let's seize the attention, let's seize the resources, and let's try to make changes in communities across the country where we can, because maybe that's what this opportunity is largely about. So it's a really big issue for the president.
There's one last question.
One last? Okay.
Two left.
Thanks for coming. My question is, are there any plans to expand My Brother's Keeper to help more girls of color?
So there is, in fact, there was a major meeting at the White House today with, particularly around the issue of reentry and women in the criminal justice system. One of my dear friends and colleagues in the White House, Valerie Jarrett, is, along with Tina Chen, who is the First Lady's Chief of Staff, are co-chairs of something called the Council of Women and Girls. And they have turned a lot of focus, especially as MBK has gotten more attention and support, to ways to make sure the Council of Women and Girls can more effectively address particular problems that are tied to disparities affecting girls and women of color as well. So we're actually quite glad to see that the attention and some of the criticism that's been directed at MBK by people who said, well, what about the girls, has led to even greater support, not within the White House where it already was, but from foundations and others who are now focused more on targeting resources for girls and women of color as well. One more question.
You talked about the importance of getting involved and staying motivated. As a white male, my experience is totally different. Is there any ways I should or shouldn't get involved?
No, sorry. First of all, you should get involved. And you should get involved genuinely, right? And you should get involved in ways that don't come at this, as sometimes happens, kind of with a missionary sense of things, right? Because there's a lot for all of us to learn about the young people we want to serve. So be willing to listen to them about what their concerns are, but get engaged as a mentor, right? You can make such a difference in the life of a young person. Just get engaged at all sorts of levels. And don't be surprised if perhaps some of your life experiences, in fact, aren't that different than what you will find in some of the young people that you would work with. Because there are a lot of wonderful surprise mentorship relationships out there where people have found that they share a lot more in common than they expected that they would. So, yeah, thanks. It's still sunny outside, too. It feels like it's Florida. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here and for doing Holy Cross proud. So I hope you picked up at least one more philosophy major.
I didn't see any. I don't know. But take a class. Take a couple classes at least. Sorry.